Welcome to the Warning podcast. We're going to talk about the public health. We're going to talk about what's going on in the country, what's happening at the Centers for Disease Control, the demolition of the capabilities of the United States government to protect the American people from diseases that could have catastrophic impact. And we'll talk about all of that, what's happening, some of the snake oil salespeople that are running loose upon the proverbial American prairie in this age of unrestrained MAGA corruption. And so can't think of a better person to be joined with than Angela. So thank you all very much for getting on as we get into the conversation. Angela, we have an organization, and you are a member of the steering committee, and that organization is called the Save America Movement. Bishop William Barber is involved in it. We have people from all walks of life. We have at that steering committee table, we have actors, we have musicians, we have some of the leading advertising creators that you could find anywhere. And we have scientists, we have medical professions, we have people who are deeply involved in the public lands which are under assault. One of the areas that we talk about in this organization, which is a roundtable of Americans from all walks of life, is what's happening at the uh, Department of Health and Human Services under the leadership of Robert Kennedy, what the impact of that will be. When you look out in the totality of everything that's happening, and one thing that we didn't know in November of 2024 was what the face of the administration would be, who would be the agents who would administer the insanity. And now we know more. We know as we get ready to turn the clock to September that the impacts on global health, that from the amount of children that will starve in the world, the amount of people that will die from cured diseases or diseases that were managed with American aid, that number globally is in excess of 15 million people when we consider the total immorality of everything. For everybody who's listening to us today, that is being done in your name. The withdrawal of that aid, that life-saving medicine, all over the world. Here at home, there are some vital institutions that keep people safe. And as we wait for the crowd to build a little bit, and I get into the conversation with Angela, I just want to share a story about my Uncle Bill. And he was a twin, my grandfather's twin, and he fought in the Second World War. He was a D-Day paratrooper. And when I met him, he was in a wheelchair, not from war wounds, but from polio, which he contracted after surviving combat from France to Germany and the end of the war. And so in my family, the Salk vaccine was a miracle. And there were all sorts of people that I knew growing up as somebody who's 54 now, not my age, but my parents' age, who had polio as a young kid. This was a terrible disease. And one of the great miracles of the 20th century is the curing of and prevention of diseases that are horrific, that for some reason there has been a new dogma that has risen that has taken us to the edge, and I'm not a scientist, of unleashing these terrible things back into the society. There's an institution in the United States that I think most people don't know a lot about, and it's called the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. And I think the degree to which people know anything about the CDC, it's the place that they're aware of from a movie like Outbreak, or when the pandemic's going to happen, or it's the place where some disease is going to escape from. What is, Angela, what is the CDC? And why should people care about a CDC? Why do we have a CDC? Where did it come from? It didn't exist 50 years ago or 75 years ago or 80 years ago. It came from somewhere on one date, some time in the past. Someone said, the country, the nation, we should have this. What is it?
So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are essentially our nation's federal public health agency. And just like you would have a state or even a city Department of Health, the CDC is that for the entire country, essentially. And what happened, the CDC was founded, and I'm admittedly not an expert in CDC history, but the CDC was founded, I believe, about 75 years ago. And it was founded in part because of what you were just talking about, polio and these epidemics of diseases that would rage through America. So polio in particular, I'm very interested in because I actually have nightmares about it coming back. Polio has been eliminated from the U.S. for several decades because of both the Salk and the Sabin vaccine, both of which were developed by Americans who were funded by the federal government to do their research. That was profoundly life-changing, both in the U.S. as well as across the world. There's polio now still in several countries, but it definitely could come back. And I don't think a lot of people realize how severe this was. Polio destroys your motor neurons. So once those are gone, they don't grow back. It is permanently disabling. And we are about to go back to a place, if the polio vaccine is withdrawn from the market, to where we are having a CDC that actually has to manage polio epidemics. Because it's transmitted by the fecal oral route, it's actually a gastrointestinal infection. And when it gets out of there and into the motor neurons, that's how it causes paralytic poliomyelitis, or what we think of as polio. People will go swimming. They will go to the swimming pool, and that's why a lot of kids would get it and get infected with polio there. And about 1 out of every 100 to 1 out of every 1,000 cases of polio infection would result in this permanent paralysis. And there used to be entire hospital wards full of children that had to live the rest of their life in an iron lung breathing for them because their diaphragms were permanently paralyzed from having poliovirus. And that's really what the CDC was created to prevent. The actual name of the agency is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So a big part of the CDC actually is their immunizations branch. They are responsible not only for making sure that people get vaccines, they're part of the process in evaluating the evidence and recommending those vaccines to the people who are most likely to need them. And one really, really important function of the CDC has been to actually track different diseases as they spread through the country and figure out ways that we could reduce their incidence. So for infectious diseases, the best way to reduce their incidence is to vaccinate against them and prevent them from occurring at all. And that really is what we are in danger of losing, because RFK Jr. is not only, he is clearly on board with the MAGA agenda, which is to essentially take money away from the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's Medicare, Medicaid, that is NIH, that is the FDA, and that is the CDC, as well as several other agencies that are dedicated to the health and safety of Americans. He not only plans to take their budget and help the executive branch illegally impound it so that they can centralize power within the executive branch, but also he is a true believer that vaccines are not beneficial at all, that they are harmful, and that they kill people. And in my opinion, his entire agenda is both serving Donald Trump and his consolidation of power and his claim to authoritarianism, and getting as many vaccines off the market as possible, which will result in the death of millions of people.
So I I want to go really slow through here. You are obviously a very brilliant person, and I think the vast majority of us who are engaged with you right now are not math and science and medical people at all, right? And so I want to try to unpack this. And I frankly, I have never understood it. Why is he against the vaccines? If if I went out and I was like, I'm against gravity, people would say he's a whack job. Why does this have any currency anywhere at all from a self evidence perspective? I don't get it.
So, on one hand, I don't get it either, just because I am a scientist and it's completely unsupported by the evidence. But I think that there's two things here that people should think about. One is that, and this is me playing armchair psychologist, but one is that I think, and just in my observations around the pandemic and around public health and disinformation, is that people like to have an explanation for something. And sometimes it doesn't matter if that explanation is true. It matters if that explanation is easy to understand, and sometimes if it elicits other feelings that people are really wanting to confirm. So it confirms their own bias. And the anti-vaccine movement is really, really good at this type of manipulation. You know, and Kennedy is a great example of this. So he will get up there and say, vaccines are unsafe. And they're not unsafe because we have evidence that they're unsafe, or else he'll make something up about it. But they're unsafe because Big Pharma is trying to make money off of them and give them to you. So it turns into a conspiracy theory. And I think that people, I've really wondered, and I don't have the answer why people like conspiracy theories so much. But I think oftentimes it's it's an intriguing story, and it allows you to blame some sort of bad guy. And in this case, it's the pharmaceutical companies. Kennedy has also blamed the government and the people at the CDC, he's called the CDC a quote cesspool of corruption, saying that they're in big pharma's pocket. And I think that narrative appeals to some people. There's a bad person or group of people or a shadowy cabal of companies, and they are all out to make money off of you at the expense of your health. But every accusation I've noticed with this administration is also a confession. It's actually not the CDC or the vaccine manufacturers who are doing wrong here and trying to profit off of the lost health of the American people. It's actually Kennedy himself. And that's the second thing that people should understand about him. He has made a fortune off of being an anti-vaxxer for the last 20, 30 years. As long as he's been in it, as soon as he's founded Children's Health Defense, the organization that he used to run prior to becoming the HHS secretary, he has profited extensively. Keep in mind, he's also a trial attorney who has made a fortune carrying out litigation against different vaccine manufacturers for supposed vaccine injuries that can't be proven. And we can get into this later. This hasn't really happened yet, but one of the things he's planning to do, and he's said explicitly that he wants to do, is get rid of the vaccine court, which would enable more of these, huge blockbuster lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies. It's a way to both get vaccines out and appeal to some of these more conspiratorial beliefs, but it's also a way for him to personally profit quite handsomely. And I think that people really do need to understand that he has a financial incentive as well as being a zealot, essentially, for anti-vaccine propaganda. You know, a lot of people have talked about how he is a eugenicist, and he certainly has said things that are very sort of eugenics adjacent and not true and openly racist. For example, he said that COVID came from a lab in China and it was engineered to spare ethnic Chinese people and Ashkenazi Jews, and it was engineered to be a racial bioweapon, essentially. And that's not possible. That's not true. But I think that his own belief system is really weird to begin with, and it's also something that I would consider to be immoral and reprehensible, in that I do think he probably does believe in eugenics, which is just a fancy way of dressing up racism in science.
So is he at the core, is he a cynic or is he a zealot?
He's a little bit of both. He's a zealot and a profiteer.
Is he a believer or is he a grifter?
He's both. He believes in what he's in the scam that he is selling.
Do you believe he's psychotic?
I do. I think so I'm not again a
No.
psychologist, but I do think that he is a psychopath because the consequences of what he wants to do to vaccine policy are going to be millions of people. And to give people an idea, he's actually already done this. In Samoa in 2019, there was a nurse who incorrectly mixed some MMR vaccines with a muscle relaxant instead of the diluent that's supposed to go in there to dilute them. And 2 children died as a result of getting these huge overdoses of muscle relaxant. So in Samoa, a lot of people said, "Well, we're not taking vaccines. These 2 kids died from it." So there was a lot of anti-vax sentiment. Kennedy flew out to Samoa with Children's Health Defense, hooked up with a bunch of Samoan anti-vax activists, and started spreading disinformation. And in 2019, there was a measles outbreak as a result of all these people who did not get their children MMR shots. Kennedy not only spread disinformation and enabled this outbreak, but Brandy Zadrozny from NBC actually reported that he was hoping that more and more kids would get measles so he could conduct an essentially natural experiment on unconsenting children to see what would happen if measles spread through an unvaccinated population, which we already know people will die. And sure enough, 83 people died in Samoa, most of them, the vast majority of them, children under the age of 5. So he already knows the consequences of running a huge anti-vax campaign that will encourage a lot of people not to get their MMR shots. It's dead bodies, it's dead children, and he doesn't care, and he wants to do that at national scale in the US.
One of the things that I think is true about him is that um, my kids are in their 20s, and I don't think we have a lot of kids in their 20s with us right now, but I think there's a lot of people of a certain age that this will register with. I don't think there's another father-son duo, maybe in the history of the country, where the apple has fallen further from the tree. Right? That this guy carries the same name as Senator Robert Kennedy is God, it's disgusting. And what a disgrace he is. What a disgrace. And I want to talk about one of the elements around him, right? This whole class of grifters, Callie Means, who's one of his top aides. Callie Means is a complete fraud. I know this because Callie Means was my assistant back in 2007, 2008. He worked for me for many years. Every aspect of his resume that he claimed was refuted in a recent piece of journalism in Vanity Fair. I can account for every minute of his professional life from 2007 forward, and the full of shit factor is George Santos level with Callie Means, and Callie Means' sister is the residency dropout who's been nominated by Donald Trump on the advice of Robert Kennedy to be the Surgeon General of the United States, and there's been no hearings scheduled, no nothing, obviously, and that's because, and I can interpret that for you because she's such a whack job, right, of such extraordinary dimensions, just like her brother Callie, that there's no way they can get her through a confirmation process. So as you're sitting in a room dealing with political problems, and you have kind of the elasticity that the Trump folks have to work with around their conception of reality, the way they're dealing with the Means nomination to be Surgeon General is just to pretend it never happened. And and so that's where we are with her. But why don't you talk a little bit about the grifter Callie Means, who I understand uh decided to comment on some of your writings this week. Callie Means, a fraud again, is the guy who did my expenses. Honest to God, I was in an airport. Right, this is the most pissed off I've ever been in my life in a work situation. I was in Ronald Reagan National Airport, and I was coming back from an international flight. I had landed at Dulles, made it to a meeting, out to Reagan, right, to fly out wherever. And I went to get a Starbucks, and my ATM card, my credit card wouldn't, my Amex wouldn't work. And I was like, why won't my Amex work? And there were over $100,000 of unpaid expenses by my assistant Callie Means, right? Who was supposed to right, be in charge of that stuff. But that's the stuff that guy worked on. Um, when when you see him dropping into your comments, right, he says he objects to something you wrote, which was commenting on uh mitochondrial disease. What is mitochondrial disease, and walk us through this insanity?
Sure. This is a great question because Callie Means is a great example, and Casey Means, his sister, are a great example of people who I call it sort of scientastic language. It sounds scientific, but it's not. It doesn't make any sense. Like, most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about mitochondria. So mitochondria are organelles. They're organs essentially inside each cell in your body. And what their job is to make energy. So they're essentially the engines of your cells, the powerhouses of your cells. There are diseases that you can get and some of them are genetic. Some of them can be acquired. Most of them are genetic, but there's these metabolic diseases where basically your mitochondria are not working properly and they don't make enough ATP, which is what we call energy in the cell. And so you end up having mitochondrial dysfunction. And these are real diseases, but you can't diagnose them by looking at them, which is what I was commenting on. So RFK Jr. was in Texas, talking to all of the people he's discouraging from getting MMR vaccines and trying to bring the Maha agenda of death to Texas. And so he's talking about all of the problems that are out there in the world. And his big focus is children's health, and specifically all these chronic diseases, which he implies are caused by two things. They're caused by eating bad foods and preserved foods, and they're caused by vaccines, essentially, and over medication, the pharmaceutical industry. So he says, I was walking through the airport and I saw all these children who are facing mitochondrial challenges, is how he put it. Their faces, their body movements, and their lack of social connection all allowed RFK to diagnose every child or most of the children he saw in the airport with mitochondrial dysfunction or mitochondrial disease. And I said, maybe the kids just didn't like you because you're running around looking like a creep who wants to give them measles. And so a lot of people, it resonated with a lot of people, I guess. I've had my replies on Twitter are unusable right now because they're full of anti-vaxxers yelling at me for getting mad at Kennedy. But one of them was Callie Means, and he basically, he's done this before. He pops in every once in a while into my replies to be like, "You're stupid and obesity is a thing." And that's basically what he said here. He said that you can tell obesity from looking at it. And sure, but not all obesity is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction. And it's interesting because when you look at the book that Casey and Callie Means wrote together, called Good Energy, it's all about how you can cure your mitochondria through diet, which sure, a healthy diet again is important and you can feel great about that.
Can they
But what a
cure
health
Trump's?
I don't think so, sadly. And their idea of a healthy diet is also really stupid. It has to do with, oh, let's get rid of seed oils because of reasons and let's replace it. We'll still eat fast food. We'll still eat a bunch of shit, but it's going to have beef tallow in it instead of these seed oils that we don't like. I mean,
And that's all nonsense. All nonsense.
it's all made up nonsense. Like if you want to eat right, like most people actually know how to do that. Like eat more vegetables, eat less meat, eat less fried
Right.
things, Mediterranean diet, whatever. Like you can definitely fix your diet, but it doesn't have anything to do with mitochondrial disease. And where I really have a beef with all of this is that they claim that food is medicine. And again, eating a good diet will improve your health, but it doesn't prevent measles. It's not a substitute. It's not a substitute for insulin if you're diabetic. It is not a substitute for medications and vaccines. And that is one idea that they promote. Now, Callie Means is currently Kennedy's, lieutenant, one of his closest advisors. And they run essentially a newsletter that Casey Means puts out, which is entirely generated by AI, that's tips and tricks, and she sells insulin monitors. I mean, everything they do is monetized in the service of selling shit to people, and that it's backed up and justified by these pseudoscientific ideas that they are sharing with people. And a lot of wellness stuff, natural stuff that's very appealing to people. I understand why the average person who maybe doesn't think of this as a political issue might find this appealing to them, right? It's like, oh, well, maybe we don't need all of this confusing stuff, these mRNA shots, like all of these medications, whatever. Maybe we can just eat a salad. Maybe we should grow our own vegetables, that kind of thing. I get how that appeals to people. I mean, I understand the appeal of eating natural and keeping things simple. But the reality is, this is not a substitute for actual medicine. There is a reason why our life expectancies have continued to go up as America has funded heavily in biomedical research in the NIH. There's a reason why people have gotten healthier and live longer lives, actually, since the CDC has been around. And it's partly because they encourage things like good nutrition, but it's also because they encourage things like vaccination that prevent people from dying of these diseases.
I wanna I wanna ask you a contrarian question, right? That I think seems obvious to me as a casual observer who does not think deeply about health policy, really beyond the implications of budget policy, right? In terms of all of these issues. It so I understand that life expectancy has expanded and grown, but there's another side of that tail, right? Life expectancy for white men, for example, in the country is declining and declining rapidly. American life expectancy is falling against other advanced nations. It just anecdotally, right? Like two things, and I just tie them absolutely together. There, the whole debate on climate change over 30 years, right? Well, to me, Al Gore was right. Right, case closed. And the weather at age 54 in America is profoundly different than it was at 24. The other thing that is profoundly different is the fitness of the American people, right? When Robert Kennedy makes the point, right, and I think this is true, right? When Trump reinstates the presidential fitness test, right, for young people at school, I think that's good, right? I think that's good. I think it's a good thing,
Yeah.
right? The we don't want to live in a martial society, right? But you also need to live in a society where the majority of men can walk around the block, right? Like God forbid if we ever had a fight. And that's not the case, right? This is an unhealthy country just by observation walking around, right? You go to Europe, you don't have the supersized people, right? So something, right, causes that, right? And the American lifestyle of sitting in a car, people working for jobs, the reality that we're not a rich country for at least half the people that live in it who don't have $400. And that's what Cali means of Half Moon Bay and Stanford University and a life of soft-handed privilege doesn't understand. But to the main point, right, about that. Like what's the answer to that? Because it seems to me like that's a fundamentally big part, right, of what Robert Kennedy's in is to peddle all of the bullshit is the accuracy of the observation, which no one should argue with.
Yeah, so this is probably one of their most effective tactics is to take something like what you just described, an epidemic of obesity, an epidemic of poor health for many people. But you actually mentioned the reasons. It's not because of vaccines. It's partly because of ultra processed foods, but not entirely. And this is where I think it gets really confusing for the average person. So ultra processed foods, take it or leave it. The issue with ultra processed foods is not that they're poisonous. It's that people, and as you just mentioned, half the people in the country are living at the poverty line or just getting by, don't feel that the US is a rich country. Those ultra processed foods are affordable. And so people don't often have access to the type of, whole foods, whole grains, all the shit that Callie and Casey Means are saying is an equivalent to medicine. So people can't get access to healthy foods. And the CDC actually has a whole division on obesity and nutrition and trying to improve access to better nutrition for many people. I agree with you that the presidential fitness test is one of the few things that I don't have a beef with this administration bringing back. I think that, the CDC did have many programs, outreach programs, and this comes into the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention part, where they were actively trying to get people to live fitter, more active lifestyles. I think a big part of what you're talking about, the difference between Americans and Europeans, for example, is that Americans live a much more sedentary lifestyle. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with the pharmaceutical industry or the food industry. That just has to do with the way that our culture has developed. We drive to work everywhere. We drive everywhere. We don't walk as much as they do in Europe. We have bigger cars. We have more sedentary lifestyles. I mean, every summer, my colleagues in Europe will take like a month off and go to the beach. We don't have that sort of vacation ethic, that lifestyle, I guess, where time off work is considered just as important and valued as time at work. And so, for all of those reasons, everything you said is true. There are people, even though life expectancy up until the pandemic had increased, for many groups, it's going down. And for many people, white men, black women, white women, everybody. I mean, there are populations of these groups, subpopulations that are not going to be physically fit, and their ranks are growing. And so I think that Kennedy has a lot of appeal in that, because he takes something that is a real problem. And he does the same thing with vaccines. There are side effects to some vaccines. Some people can't take vaccines. That's actually why it's really important that everybody try to get vaccines so that we can protect those people who are not able to tolerate them. No drug is without a side effect, but Kennedy will latch on to this. And just like with food, he'll say it's the food company's fault for feeding all this ultra processed food and all these seed oils to people. That's the answer to this complex problem. Vaccines, he'll say, oh, well, the COVID shots have a slightly, well, he won't say slightly, they have a huge increase in the risk of myocarditis for young men. That's true. They have a risk, an increased risk for myocarditis. The risk of getting myocarditis and much more severe myocarditis is much higher from getting COVID than it is from getting an mRNA shot, even in the highest risk group. So he's taking something that's true and he's reframing it in basically a nest of bullshit and selling it to people that way. And that's how he gets people on board with his odious anti-public health ideas.
When this whole cast of characters was being confirmed, I was talking to friends of mine, and like the conversation would be about, right, well, if you could only stop one of them, who would it be? And there were really no wrong answers, right? You could make the case, right, that you got to stop Kennedy, you got to stop Tulsi Gabbard. In my crowd, overwhelmingly, the person was Pete Hegseth, right?
Mhm.
I was talking to a friend of mine, who we don't share in the old days a lot of politics, but we were both like, Hegseth, he's in the nuclear weapons chain of command. Um, I think you would have picked Kennedy, right? You know, we had to stop him in that, and he was a person who a lot of people said 7 months in, and I completely appreciate the position, which is I expected it to be horrible, right? But knowing that the lake is cold and jumping in the cold lake are two different things entirely. As you're experiencing this, 7 months in achieving the horrible you most worried about, is he ahead of schedule, on schedule, behind schedule? Where are we in all of this? What has surprised you? What is the space, that kind of dissonance between the intellect and the emotion of watching all this go down?
So this is kind of a hard question because in some ways Kennedy's exceeded expectations in terms of what he was going to be able to do. I actually didn't think that he would be able to so successfully dismantle some of the systems that have been in place to protect it. But the one thing, and this isn't totally Kennedy because it started before he was confirmed, but the one thing I think I didn't count on was how destructive the Doge layoffs were going to be. That was really the Valentine's Day massacre, as I call it, really, really stripped capacity out of all of those agencies and across the federal government. But what I'm most familiar with is through HHS and through FDA, NIH, and CDC. And CDC was hit particularly hard with those. I was getting messages from my colleagues and friends at CDC, essentially saying that the flu division, and at the time, and I'm still very worried about the potential of an H5N1 bird flu pandemic, but the CDC's flu division was absolutely gutted because a lot of contractors were let go, employees who were probationary. And this is, to me, one of the really cruel ironies of this. Towards the end of the Biden administration, a lot of contract workers were made permanent employees, thinking that it would protect their position, because a lot of these people were contract workers who've been working for the agency for years and in some cases decades. So they made them permanent employees, but as a result, they were probationary employees. So that ended up in their being riffed. Those cuts before Kennedy even came on board, already basically sucked the capabilities out of these agencies to carry out some of their normal functions. And when Kennedy came in, I actually didn't expect him to be as effective as he has been, and I should have known better, because he is a lawyer and he has been very, very successful at running both his anti-vax organization and making money off of it and getting into the mainstream because of it. His ideas have been, initially he was thought of as kind of a whack job, but now people are taking him more and more seriously because he's not only is he HHS secretary, but I think he's really managed over these past decades to hone his message and get to be really, really good at what he's doing. But keep in mind, again, he is a lawyer. He knows how to pull bureaucratic levers and find these loopholes to do what he wants to accomplish. And that's what I have been both impressed and horrified by, is how he's using those skills to take out vaccines, essentially. I thought that he won't be able to ban vaccines. The HHS secretary does not make this decision on his own. There are these mechanisms in place. There's something that the CDC runs called the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP. So after the FDA approves a vaccine, it goes to ACIP, and ACIP is used to be composed of 17 external experts who are all experts in vaccines, in clinical care. They're doctors, they're epidemiologists, they're vaccine researchers, that sort of thing. They get vetted extensively for conflicts of interest, so they're not voting on vaccines that they would make a profit from. And it goes to the ACIP for a vote. At the ACIP, they will evaluate this using these frameworks for evaluating evidence, so it's standardized from one ACIP to the next. They'll say, we recommend that this vaccine be given, let's say COVID vaccines, be given to everybody over the age of 6 months. And we've determined that by using these two systems called evidence to recommendations and grade, to determine that these vaccines are safe and effective for all people in that age group. So we recommend them. They vote on it. The CDC director signs off on it. And that's how insurance companies decide that they're going to reimburse for those vaccines. And that's how people get access to those vaccines. Well, in June, Kennedy fired the entire ACIP, and he replaced them with 8 of the worst anti-vaxxers you can possibly imagine. The head of ACIP is this guy named Martin Kulldorff, who was fired from Harvard for refusing a vaccine. He has since written incredibly anti-vax things, and yet still claims to be pro-vaccine. It has Robert Malone, who claims to have invented the mRNA vaccine, but he did not. And he also thinks that the spike protein of SARS coronavirus 2 is toxic and kills people. Retsef Levi, who is the mRNA czar now on ACIP, is an operations supply chain management expert, who has no infectious disease background and who has said since 2023, anyways, that mRNA vaccines kill people untruthfully. So, and then there's, somebody who used to be involved with Children's Health Defense on there, and a bunch of other anti-vaxxers. So those are the people who are now evaluating vaccines. And guess what? They're not using the evidence-based framework. They are not doing any of this. They're basically banning stuff that they don't like. And that is a way for Kennedy to ban vaccines without actually banning them. If the ACIP won't recommend them, the CDC director can't sign off on them. And then insurance companies won't pay for them. And then pharmacies won't stock them. And eventually the manufacturers won't have a market to manufacture vaccines for. So they might stop making them, period. So it's using these bureaucratic loopholes that people don't really think about to essentially ban vaccines without banning them.
So let's jump ahead to where the ball is going to be and try to meet it there. So, um, one of the things I said before the election, but it's much more vivid now, is that I didn't think that Democrats, and by Democrats I meant people in government in opposition to this, right, in the Congress, had enough of appreciation that all of the things that they were defending were going to be gone. and that this almost childlike idea of that there'll be an election 3 years from now and then everything goes back. This is all gone, right? These things are wrecked. And at some point it means coming to the realization or acknowledgement that we have fallen back from an apogee of human progress and science, at least in this country, right? We were seized by the Luddites and the scammers, and we're falling backwards. On the question of the economy, right? Going back 6 months, and I'm not an economist, um, but I know, looking at a lot of the data, that coming into September, coming into the fall, the economy is season for ordinary people. Trump's numbers are dropping, and so any idea, right, that these policies will bring prosperity, right? I know that's not going to happen, right? How bad it will become, hard to say, right? I don't have the precision, the ability to prognosticate at that depth. But in that vein, what's going to happen here, right? What is the implication here, right? In 3 years' time, right? That the institutions that you're talking about as important institutions effectively have been rendered non-functional, or do they remain semi-functional, or will they exist at all in 3 years' time? And what is the implication for the American society and the American people without these things? And if, right, and I don't mean to belabor it, right, looking ahead, if you were to go talk to, right, the next Democratic presidential nomination, what would you advise them that they need to say about what will need to be rebuilt, right? What's been wrecked has to be met with what?
This is a really hard question, too, because to just kind of break it down, right now, these agencies, as they're operating, are, I would say, semi functional. Um, CDC is on life support. These institutions, NIH, CDC, FDA, will probably still exist in 3 years, but they won't be the same institutions that they were. And that's why I was so concerned this week when they fired the CDC director, Susan Moneras, for not being willing, essentially, to shit can COVID vaccines altogether without any evidence. And at least that's been what's reported, was that she refused to go along with their plan to take COVID vaccines off the market entirely. And I believe that it's not just COVID vaccines that they're going after. COVID vaccines are how they're getting in the door to normalize this for people. It's going to be COVID vaccines now, and then it's going to be flu vaccines, HPV, the MMR, and maybe the polio vaccine, the DTaP vaccine, everything with an aluminum salt adjuvant in it. Everything that basically they say that they're going to find the cure for autism and they're going to announce it. And spoiler alert, it's going to be vaccines. They are laying the groundwork to do this for all vaccines. So when the director was fired, and I'm not sure what the status is of that now because the White House says she's fired, and her lawyers, Trump's former lawyers, which I think is a great strategy, came back and said, no, Trump has to fire her personally. And so it's unclear. But being fired or attempting to fire her or get her to resign on the basis of not wanting to go along with this plan to essentially gut public health when the consequences would be millions of dead people, is commendable for her. But it's very, very alarming in terms of what the CDC has in store for it. So Susan Moneras is probably not going to be the CDC director if she's not already gone. But then, in addition to that, 4 senior CDC officials, career public health people, also were given that choice, and they chose to resign rather than participate in essentially the destruction of American public health. And I couldn't be prouder of my colleagues for taking that stand. But the loss of their leadership and experience, for example, Dimitri Daskalakis was head of the National Center for Influenza and Respiratory Diseases. I've worked with him for about H5. He is fantastic. He did incredible work during the Mpox, the monkeypox outbreak in 2022, reaching out to the gay community to make sure that they were getting access to vaccines. These are people who have a ton of experience. They're motivated by trying to improve the health and safety of the American people and really American security as well, because health security is a huge part of public health. And without their leadership, I think that the dedicated employees, the career scientists and public servants who work at CDC are not really going to be able to get that much done. They're not going to be able to carry out the normal functions of their jobs. And let's also not forget that thanks to RFK's rhetoric about vaccines, the CDC was a target of a domestic terror attack on August 8th, in which a gunman shot 500 bullets at the CDC and killed a police officer. And that gunman was motivated by a belief that he'd been injured by the COVID vaccine because of disinformation like what RFK has shared. I mean, I'm at a loss to understand how an agency can work when they're a federal agency that was targeted by a domestic terrorist, and the president hasn't done anything about it. RFK waited 24 hours to even share condolences with the people at CDC. I don't understand how you could possibly be able to get anything done if you are an employee of CDC with no more leadership, with no more funding to do anything, with no support from HHS, and threats hanging over your head all the time that if you don't get on board with this plan that these people know, they're scientists, will kill people. If you are unwilling to do that, then you're going to, at the very least, lose your job. And maybe, there will be consequences beyond that. I don't think we've gotten to that phase where people are going to start being targeted and detained, but I do think that might be coming. And what people really, I think, need to understand is that they're going to replace all of the actually competent people who've departed these agencies with more anti-vaxxers, more political appointees. Russell Vought clearly wrote, even though it was from Donald Trump's desk, an executive order that said that at the NIH, they're going to essentially have political appointees get involved in the peer review process. And so these are people who will be screening grants for not for scientific merit, but for ideological purity, essentially. This is no different than what Stalin did. My husband grew up in the Soviet Union. He's 20 years older than me. And so he got a PhD in the late 1980s in protein biochemistry at the Shemaikin Institute of Bioorganic Chemistry in Moscow. And he told me that basically one of the things they had to deal with was not just annoying university administrators. They had to deal with these commissars who would evaluate them for essentially heresy against Soviet communism. And that's basically what's going to happen at these federal agencies. They're not going to be able to function any longer as agencies of health where they're prioritizing the health and safety of the American people because they're going to be prioritizing Donald Trump's political goals.
I I saw someone make a comment from Lake Tahoe, and I'm gonna ask the question this way, and I'm gonna put you on the spot in an unfair way because I'm gonna ask you to predict the future, but I'm not really holding you to that standard. But I want you to generally give us a sense of time. And and so here's my Lake Tahoe story. Um, I lived up in Lake Tahoe for a number of years, one of the great, most beautiful lakes in the world, but it's a cold lake. And I love more than anything being out on the water on a boat. And it was early in the boating season on Lake Tahoe in May. And it was twilight, and I was coming back into the marina, and I was the only boat that you could see. And I just caught something on my eye, and it was two teenage boys who had capsized on their paddleboard, and I fished them out, and I pulled them on the boat. And my operating theory in these circumstances is I'm not your dad, but I'm someone's dad. And I talked to them the way that I would hope that someone would talk to one of my shithead kids, right? If they had done something so stupid. And the point that I made to them is there were no other fucking boats on the lake unless I came along, right? And it was a miracle that I saw them, and there was no chance of them swimming to shore. And the question I asked, right, is at the temperature of the water, how long they thought they had. And the answer was about 12 minutes. And we talked about that in the way that men sometimes got to talk to young men in an emphatic manner, using that as our guidepost. If you shatter, right, the vaccine regimen, right, that over decades that we can prevent these terrible diseases, how long does the country have until the implications of this aren't theoretical, right? There's just a lot more body bags, right? That it's like you can't hide the death, right? Like in Texas, you haven't had a measles death in a kid in 30 years. You have a couple, but like two's not enough dead kids, obviously not in this country. So when do we get to the point when you literally have thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are dying, where it becomes commonplace again, where, you have a kid dies of a sickness, right, during the school year that no one's died of in 50 years? Like when does that happen? Is that 5 years from now? Is that 2 years from now? Is that 7 months from now? When does the implications and consequences of this insanity start?
Well, I'm hoping that people understand it as soon as possible. And I don't know when people are going to start understanding it. But as you just pointed out, it's already started. The measles deaths were completely preventable. And essentially, I mean, that is the start of it. I don't know when people are going to actually start caring. But once we start to really see those numbers, it's not going to be noticeable at first because the first thing that's been taken away are COVID vaccines. Now, the reason I think that they kind of started with COVID vaccines is because there's already low uptake. Most people have had COVID. They don't see it as a lethal threat. But COVID still does kill a lot of people every year. It's getting to be like seasonal flu, where it's something that we just live with. We don't have nightmares about it, but you still should get vaccinated against it because in a normal year, seasonal flu kills 30 to 60,000 Americans. This past year was a record flu season, by the way. There was the highest level of child mortality due to influenza since the pandemic in 2009. So it has already started, but people aren't noticing. And I think that's the thing. What's going to happen, I think, is a couple different things. At the last ACIP meeting that was staffed by all these anti-vaxxers, they took thimerosal off the market. They derecommended vaccines that contain this preservative thimerosal with basically no evidence. Thimerosal has been shown to be very safe, and it's actually not in that many vaccines. So they did that. That's kind of a trial balloon for getting some of these things across. They put on the agenda the MMRV vaccine, which is the MMR vaccine combined with the vaccine for chickenpox. They're probably going to vote on that at the ACIP meeting in October. What I think they're going to do is not recommend it. And that will be the opening for them to take on the MMR early next year. When they take on the MMR, that is going to cause measles outbreaks, the next measles outbreak, which will happen in the next definitely in the next year, there will be another measles outbreak. It will probably be bigger. More children will probably die. It will spread to other countries, just as this outbreak has. Here in Canada, we've actually had an even bigger measles outbreak just due to vaccine disinformation alone. But once they take the MMR vaccine away, then we are going to see these measles numbers explode. We're also going to start seeing diseases that people don't think about very much anymore, like congenital rubella disease. People have not seen rubella in a long time, and a big epidemic of rubella will also kill children. It is also a fatal disease that looks a lot like measles. It can also cause permanent disability when pregnant women are infected with rubella virus, and then their babies can be blind and deaf and have brain damage. Um, if Kennedy has also suggested, and he hasn't taken any action on this yet, but I do expect it to happen, that aluminum salt adjuvants are unsafe. Now, aluminum salt adjuvants are just salts of aluminum that stimulate your immune system. So they essentially make vaccines work better. These inactivated vaccines. There's a lot of inactivated vaccines that we get. So if he is successful at removing aluminum salt adjuvants, we will no longer have a hepatitis A vaccine. We will no longer have a hepatitis B vaccine. We won't be able to use Gardasil, which is one that he particularly hates. We will not be able to get certain travel vaccines, Japanese encephalitis virus and chikungunya virus. We will not be able to give our children Hib vaccines, which is a type of bacteria that causes fatal pneumonia in babies. We will not be able to get older people pneumococcal vaccines, which protects them from a type of pneumonia that can be fatal. We will not be able to protect children from bacterial meningitis. We will not be able to protect children from polio. We will not be able to protect children from diphtheria, tetanus, or pertussis. There are already pertussis outbreaks occurring. So we are going to start to see all of these diseases come back within the next year as soon as those vaccines are off the
including
market.
polio. Will you have a polio case in the United States in the next year?
I think that we probably will. So I did my PhD in a polio lab at Columbia University, a lab that has now been defunded since that institution has been shaken down. And I've actually seen what polio looks like in a lab mouse that I gave polio to. And it's one of the most horrific things I've ever seen. And I've seen what Ebola looks like in a lab mouse. Polio's worse. I cannot imagine what will happen if we start seeing hundreds or thousands of kids that need to be in an iron lung for the rest of their lives. I think that polio already came back in an anti-vax community, in a traveler who got polio and was paralyzed from it, an adult. But I think there has been widespread use of it's still the Salk vaccine. It's a little bit differently formulated, but that's what we use in the US. And most people do get that beginning at 2 months of age. So fortunately, all the kids who've been born now, most of them still have been vaccinated against polio. But the second that that vaccine becomes unavailable, it's a 4-dose regimen that has to be given over several years. So really young kids won't be able to get their boosters. They won't have as long of lasting immunity, and newborns will not have it at all. Now, poliovirus is extremely hardy, and it can last in the environment and remain infectious for a very long time. So poliovirus is around, and people can certainly re-import poliovirus to the U.S. as soon as it starts infecting people. We will probably start to see polio epidemics. And it just depends on how large that critical mass of unvaccinated kids is when we start seeing it. But yes, I do believe that we're going to start seeing polio. It'll start trickling in. And then, depending again on how effective they are at removing access to the polio vaccine, we might start seeing polio epidemics. And I truly do have nightmares about polio. I never imagined that I would be in a situation where I'm explaining to people what polio is. It's probably one of the saddest times to be in public health because we never thought that we would have to actually deal with outbreaks of this. My biggest concern, my final thought, is that normally, again, the CDC was founded to deal in part with some of these types of epidemics. Now we're not going to have a CDC that is going to be responsive to these epidemics of these preventable diseases. And if we don't have the CDC responding to those, then guess what? If there's a pandemic, if there's a bird flu pandemic, the CDC won't be able to respond to that either. And we are in really, really terrible trouble because for all of the criticisms of the response to the COVID pandemic, having a non-functional CDC, a non-functional NIH, and a non-functional FDA, we are fucked.
Well, so there's a question that um it annoys the shit out of me. But people advise me, right, that I should ask the question, right? Which is, what can I do? And the answer to the question is, well, vote, right? Because there are consequences in an election. But what can your average person do given what we just talked about?
Three things, I think. One, just for their own well-being, get vaccinated and get your vaccines updated now for everything that you can, because I don't know how long they're going to be there. If you have young kids, talk to their pediatrician and talk about what vaccines they're eligible for. Make sure they're completely up to date. Because here in Canada, Americans won't necessarily be able to come across the border and get vaccines that are no longer available in the States. The Canadian health system works in a different way. And so you actually have to live in Canada to get access to that in many cases. So people should immediately get vaccinated for themselves and their family and make sure that they're completely up to date on that. But the things that they can do about this, besides voting, one, I think, is actually to just share this information with their friends, make people aware of it, and scream about it. Like, make sure that people understand what's going on so that we're speaking up about this as a unified American people. But the second thing that is more specific that they can do is get in touch with your congressional representatives, because the only way to get RFK out of office, or out of the health Department of Health and Human Services, is to either have him resign or impeach him. And right now, the Senate continues to do nothing about RFK. Our congressional representatives continue to not hold him accountable for what he's doing. The Democrats are trying, but we need some Republicans also to jump on board with this. Historically, vaccines and public health have been very bipartisan issues. So people, especially if they live in a state where their representative is a Republican, really need to let them know, like, that this is completely unacceptable. We should not be playing politics with thousands or even millions of American lives. And I think that with enough pressure, we might actually get some of these congressional representatives to take some kind of action to stop and at least put the brakes on RFK, but they are really the only ones that can impeach him. Otherwise, he just needs to have a lot of pressure put on him. And that's why you shouldn't just demand his resignation. You should also put pressure on Donald Trump, because he is not making America healthy again. He's making America sick and dead again. And I think that people really, really need to understand this, that the only way we can get him out of there, that's the only thing we can do, is to either have him resign or get him impeached. So let's put the pressure on.
Um, I wanted to I wanted to ask you. I don't. He's not going to resign,
No.
and he won't be impeached. And so into the ground we go with some of this. I'm a big believer in consequences. I think that one of the things that has dissipated just completely in my adult life from the time I was 21 to age 54 is the causality between action and consequence. That if you allow people to do A, then necessarily B follows, and B can be terrible. And somehow, some way, for some reason, the society writ large thinks it's immunized from terrible. But if what you said is accurate, and certainly it seems accurate just at a common sense level to me, right? We're gonna have immense issues and challenges. And the last question I wanted to ask you is just to help give context to Dr. Cassidy in the United States Senate. And you have a guy who could have stopped Robert Kennedy's confirmation, physician, do no harm. He certainly understood the implications of all of this. He talked about it. And now, 7 months later, he has a firm idea of what's happening. Clearly understands the science. What would you say to him?
He needs to be accountable for his part in all of this. You know, he it's one thing to have somebody like RFK promise you that they're not going to mess around with vaccines, that they're not going to take away vaccine access. And Kennedy, of course, can say, well, look, I haven't banned vaccines, but he certainly has taken away access. And I think that Dr. Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, is fully aware of, or Cassidy is fully aware of that. I think that there needs to be some political accountability for him in standing up for this. And I completely agree with what you just said about the dissipation of consequences for actions. There seems to be no consequences. Cassidy is not holding Kennedy accountable for the fact that he lied to him when he promised him that he would not be doing anything differently with vaccines and he would not be screwing around too much with public health. He has completely upended public health and gutted our public health capacity. So I think that there needs to be some accountability. Either Cassidy has to hold Kennedy accountable or we need to hold Cassidy accountable.
I lied. One last question. A few months back, Politico, believe it was Politico, hosted Callie Means. And Callie Means was interviewed by a star Politico reporter, Leanne Caldwell, and interviews Callie for an hour. And Callie Means does his usual type of blustering performance. He has no core scientific qualifications. And this precedes the Vanity Fair expose that identifies his fraudulence. Let's use George Santos as our fixed point on the old map so we can get our bearing, right? He's in prison, he's a felon, he's a fraud, right? But he's a fabulist. And I put Callie Means, again, I've known Callie since he was 21, against his claims. He's in the same level of fabulism when he talks about all of these issues. Uh, his sister, the residency dropout, right, did graduate from medical school, didn't complete her program, but he has as much scientific training as I did, right? Is zero. When the next time a reporter, a journalist, interacts with Callie Means, right? What should they know about him?
I think they should know that he was previously, he has an MBA and he was previously running a wedding dress business. I mean, those are his qualifications. I think they should know that he was an incompetent personal and professional assistant to you. I think that they
It
should
definitely
know
was.
I think that they should know that he's not remotely competent. He's a part of a cakeistocracy, and that's intentional. And I think more than anything, they should know that he's a grifter, and you can't trust anything that he says because everything that he says is in service of lining his own pockets and accelerating his path to having power and influence. It is not because he's interested in your good health or the well-being of your mitochondria or whatever kind of bullshit he's going to be talking about. He's trying to take your money.
Well, perfect place to leave it. Uh, and in fact, this conversation reminds me. John McCain would always tell an audience. He'd get up there and he'd always tell a couple jokes, but he would always quote apocryphally. He made it up, but he would say Chairman Mao's favorite quote. And then he would remind the audience to remember it's always darkest before it's completely black. And so that's my thought from this conversation today. But in all seriousness, these are really serious issues, right? And you have a collection of moral misfits, incompetents, political extremists who have life and death decision making authority that will impact millions of lives. And we live in a time of epic cowardice. And I wish I had an answer for someone, like that just asked a question about Mitch McConnell had polio. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And that's part of the evil of the moment, right? That's the part of the collaboration and the weakness and the capitulance to all of it. And it's just tragic beyond words. But I think what everybody should understand is that you don't have to tolerate it, that you need to stand up against it, and encourage you to go find your way to the Save America movement as we build this organization. It's active all over the country. And one of the things that Americans are going to have to rediscover is the practice of citizenship. And we are besieged on all fronts by a grave menace in this country. And anybody who underestimates it, I think at this point is just not awake, is pretty naive. What has been building has gathered, and it has come, and it is here. And there are two elections left in this country, and the first one is the much easier election, and it doesn't require even a functioning Democratic Party. All it requires is the judgment of the American people to say no, no, and to put a check on this, right? To elect anybody, right, who will tell the guy no, right, and stand up to it at every conceivable space. Elect people who will tell these people no. And if we don't, then the consequences are going to build and build and build. And it's too late to stop the death that's coming. But it is not too late to stop the death that can still be prevented. And that's how you have to think about it. We're well past the line where the damage, right, to these institutions in our country can be looked away from. The damage is epic. The consequences are deeply serious, and they include the public health of millions and millions and millions of Americans, including children. What's happening is a travesty. I hope having Dr. Rasmussen here today helped you understand it a little bit better. And I just ask that all of you reflect seriously on your country in this moment, and understand that unless and until we all together stand up in a unified way against it, Donald Trump remains the biggest gorilla in the room, and he will continue to move forward until there is some opposing force that makes it stop. And until and unless we make it stop, a lot of bad things are going to happen. We'll leave it there today. Thank you so much. Be a good American, be a good citizen, stand up against this. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Angela Rasmussen.
Thanks, Steve. Anytime.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning. I invite you to join this community where I promise to be honest, blunt, and direct about what is happening in this country. America is in crisis. Follow and subscribe to this channel and on Substack. Thank you.